There was no coffin. That is the fact that stops you when you find it buried in the historical record. Not dramatized, not exaggerated, just sitting there in the chronicle like a stone dropped into still water. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of the future Elizabeth I, the woman whose marriage to Henry VIII had fractured the entire religious architecture of a nation. When her head came off on the morning of May 19, 1536, nobody had thought to prepare a box to put her in. Or rather, somebody had decided not to. What they found was an elm chest used to store arrows. Her body was placed inside it. Her head, wrapped in linen by her own ladies-in-waiting, women so frightened they could barely speak, was laid alongside her. And she was carried into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls and put into the ground without a marker, without a monument, without even her name scratched into the stone above her. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what a burial meant in the Tudor world. This was not an era of quiet, private grief. Death in 16th century England was a public transaction, heavily freighted with meaning, ritual, and politics. The tombs of the powerful were not simply graves, they were arguments. They said, this person existed, this person mattered, this person had a claim on the world and on God's mercy, and we, the living, are witnesses to that claim. Nobles and monarchs spent fortunes, sometimes years of planning, on their funerary monuments. Effigies were commissioned. Chantry chapels were endowed so that priests would pray for the soul indefinitely. The physical permanence of a marked grave was inseparable from the idea of legitimate legacy. To deny someone that was not an oversight. It was a sentence. It was a statement delivered in stone and silence that said, "You have no legacy. You were not what you claimed to be. We are not obligated to remember you." Henry VIII had already made this argument in every other dimension of Anne's existence. Within weeks of her arrest, royal craftsmen were at work removing her heraldic badges from buildings, stripping her initials from walls, overpainting the intertwined H and A that had been carved into the fabric of the palaces she had walked through as queen. Her portraits were suppressed. Her name disappeared from official documents. The legal machinery of the Tudor state worked quickly and efficiently to produce a world in which Anne Boleyn had never quite been queen at all, in which her marriage to Henry had been declared void, which meant, with a cruelty that must have been felt by everyone who understood it, that the daughter she had given him was now legally a bastard. The arrow box was simply the final punctuation on a sentence that had been forming for months. But what lingers, what refuses to settle into comfortable historical distance, is not the political logic of what Henry did. That logic is legible, even if it is monstrous. What lingers is the image of her women. There were 4 of them present at the execution on Tower Green that morning. Their names are known: Margaret Lee, Mary Scrope, Elizabeth Wood, and a 4th whose identity the records leave uncertain. These were women who had served Anne through her years of power, through the investigations, through the arrest, through the weeks in the tower when everything was collapsing. And now they stood and watched the sword come down. And then they had to do what no official provision had been made for anyone to do. The Portuguese diplomat Lopo de Sousa, who sent dispatches back to Lisbon describing the execution, noted the chaos of the immediate aftermath, the absence of ceremony, the visible distress of the attendants, the sense that the killing had been efficient and the disposal of the body had been left to improvisation. A later account preserved in the Calendar of State Papers describes the ladies gathering the remains themselves, wrapping the head in their own linen, the kind of intimate and terrible task that history usually renders abstract, but that in practice meant kneeling on the straw of a scaffold and performing an act of love under conditions of extreme fear, watched by the men who had just carried out the execution. These women were not safe. Several of them were under varying degrees of suspicion simply for having served Anne. To mourn her too openly, to linger too long, to weep where the wrong person might see, any of this could draw attention they could not afford. And yet they wrapped her head. They carried her into the chapel. They stayed with her until she was in the ground. The historian Eric Ives, whose biography of Anne Boleyn remains the most serious and thorough scholarly treatment of her life, described the burial as a reflection of the Crown's comprehensive effort to deny Anne any posthumous dignity. The arrow box has become, in some sense, the image that survives when all the political argument has faded, not because it is the most historically consequential detail, but because it is the most nakedly human one. It tells you something about the texture of that morning that no legal document can. She had been queen. She had changed the religion of England. She had survived years of court politics that destroyed most of the people who attempted them. And in the end, she was carried to her grave in a box that had held weapons by women who were afraid to cry. That is what power looks like when it decides someone never existed. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply forgets to order a coffin and leaves the rest to the women standing in the straw. In 1876, workers lifted the stones beneath the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and found chaos. Not the ordered rest of the honored dead, not neat coffins arranged in respectful rows, names and dates preserved against time. What they found was a confusion of bones, centuries of the towers executed, the condemned, the politically inconvenient, all pressed together in shared earth, their identities scrambled by decay and the indifference of the men who had put them there. And somewhere in that disorder, they were supposed to find a queen. The question of whether the remains eventually reinterred as Anne Boleyn's actually belonged to her has never been conclusively answered. That fact is not dramatic speculation. It is the sober assessment of the historical record. And it matters, not just as a forensic curiosity, but as the final chapter of a story about what happens when a state decides that a person's body, like her reputation, like her name, like her daughter's legitimacy, is simply not worth the effort of proper care. To understand the 1876 exhumation, you need to understand what the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula actually was by that point in history. It is a small Norman chapel, modest almost to the point of invisibility, sitting within the Tower of London's Inner Ward. It was never designed to be a royal mausoleum. It became one by accumulation, by the steady weight of Tudor and later Stuart executions, each body needing to go somewhere close and quiet, somewhere that would not become a pilgrimage site or a focus of public grief. Thomas More was buried there, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Thomas Cromwell, the two dukes executed under Henry VIII. The space beneath its floor became, over the decades, an archaeological record of English state violence, but it was never managed as such. Bodies were added without consistent documentation, without marked graves, without the kind of careful spatial record-keeping that would have made later identification possible. By the time Queen Victoria ordered the restoration of the chapel in the 1870s, partly for structural reasons, partly from a Victorian impulse toward retrospective dignity, the floor had not been systematically examined in centuries. Doyne Bell, the surveyor tasked with overseeing the work and documenting what was found, approached his task with genuine scholarly seriousness. His report, published in 1877 under the title Notices of the Historic Persons Buried in the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, is the primary document of record. What it describes is not a dignified rediscovery, it is a careful inventory of disorder. Coffins had rotted into each other. Bones from adjacent burials had shifted and intermingled. Some burials showed evidence of having been disturbed at some prior point, moved or partially moved, for reasons that the surviving records do not explain. The depth and placement of remains did not always match what the limited documentary evidence suggested they should. Bell worked methodically, correlating what he found with historical records of who had been buried where and when, but the honest truth embedded in his own report is that the identifications he made were probabilistic, not certain. He was doing his best with fragmentary evidence in conditions that made certainty impossible. The remains identified as Anne Boleyn's were those of a woman estimated to be between 25 and 35 years of age at death, with a notably slight and delicate skeletal frame. The location of the find corresponded broadly with what the historical record suggested about where Anne had been buried in 1536. Bell concluded, with reasonable confidence, that these were her remains. The Victorians received this conclusion with relief, reinterred everything with ceremony, and installed the marble tablets that mark the graves today, giving the chapel the appearance of order that the centuries had refused to provide naturally. But Bell's report contains a detail that resists easy resolution. The skull he attributed to Anne showed no definitive evidence of the clean, precise severance that a skilled swordsman would have produced. The historical record tells us that the executioner imported from Calais was considered expert in his work, that the beheading was swift, that Anne died without prolonged suffering. A blade wielded with professional precision against an exposed neck should leave a mark on the vertebrae that is recognizable even after centuries of decomposition. The absence of clear evidence in the skull Bell examined has been explained in various ways. The degradation of 340 years, the disturbance of the remains before or after his examination, the imprecision of Victorian forensic standards. All of these explanations are plausible. None of them is conclusive. What cannot be dismissed is the simpler possibility that the head and body placed in that arrow chest in 1536 were not kept together with sufficient care during burial to guarantee they remained together. The women who wrapped Anne's remains did so in conditions of grief and fear, without official supervision, without ceremony. The gravediggers who received the chest were not working under conditions that encouraged precision or documentation. The chapel floor was closed over the burial without a marker. If the head and body shifted during interment, or were placed with the kind of approximate care that the absence of any official protocol made likely, there would have been no one responsible for noticing and no record of it if they had. Alison Weir, in The Lady in the Tower, addresses this question with the measured uncertainty it deserves. The identification of 1876 is the best available conclusion from the evidence that exists. But the evidence that exists is thin, disturbed, and 3 centuries removed from the event it is meant to illuminate. The woman who changed England's religion, who bore its greatest queen, who was destroyed by the most systematic act of personal erasure in Tudor history. She may be resting exactly where the marble tablet says she is. Or the bones identified as hers may belong to someone else entirely, another of the tower's many forgotten dead, while Anne lies misidentified in an adjacent grave, or scattered, or lost. The Victorians sealed the vault after the reinterment. The Church of England has declined subsequent requests for further forensic examination. The question remains open, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet persistence of a thing that was never properly resolved because the people with the authority to resolve it decided, at every available moment in history, that Anne Boleyn's remains were simply not worth the trouble of caring about correctly. That is not a dramatic conclusion. It is a factual one. And it is, in its quiet way, the most disturbing thing about this entire story. He arrived quietly. No fanfare, no public announcement. Just a man crossing the channel from Calais sometime in the days before May 19, 1536, carrying the specific skill that the English crown had decided it needed for a specific task. His name has been debated by historians for centuries. Some records suggest he was called Jean Rombaut. Others dispute even that. What is not disputed is what he was, what he had been hired to do, and the fact that Henry VIII considered the importation of a French swordsman, rather than the use of the Tower's own axeman, to be an act of mercy toward the woman he was about to have killed. That is where the story begins to disturb in ways that simple brutality cannot. Not in the blade, not in the blood, but in the framing, in the careful construction of a killing as a kindness, in the theater of compassion that Tudor power staged around an act of absolute political destruction. Anne Boleyn was going to die. That had been decided. What remained to be choreographed was how the watching world would feel about it. To understand what the sword meant, you have to understand what the axe meant. Beheading by axe in Tudor England was a public performance of degradation as much as execution. The condemned knelt at a block, pressed their neck against the wood, and waited. The axeman, a domestic official, a known figure, someone who had performed this function many times before on criminals and traitors of lower status, raised his implement, and brought it down. In practice, the results were frequently catastrophic. The axe was heavy, the angle difficult, and the executioner's skill variable. Multiple blows were common. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, executed in 1541, reportedly required 11 strokes before she died. The crowd watching these executions was not shielded from what they saw. The mess, the prolongation, the visible suffering, all of it was part of the message that state power sent through the bodies of those it destroyed. The sword was different in method, and its difference was legible to everyone present. It required a standing or kneeling posture rather than prostration over a block, a posture with more dignity, more agency, more visual control for the condemned. A skilled swordsman, working with a long two-handed blade, could produce a clean, single severance faster than the eye could fully register. The French tradition of execution by sword was associated with continental sophistication, with the treatment of high-status prisoners, with a kind of technical excellence that the axe could never claim. When Henry VIII arranged for a French swordsman to cross the Channel specifically for Anne's execution, he was sending a signal to his court, to his ambassadors, to the watching diplomatic community of Europe, that he was a civilized king dealing mercifully with a woman he had regretfully been forced to destroy. The mercy, to be absolutely clear, was not for Anne. She was still going to die on a scaffold in the Tower of London, convicted of charges that the majority of serious historians today consider fabricated. The mercy was a diplomatic performance. It was for the audience. The morning of May 19th was cold and overcast, as May mornings in London frequently are. Anne had been inside the tower for 18 days by then, arrested on May 2nd, tried and convicted by a panel that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who pronounced the guilty verdict without visible discomfort. She had spent those 18 days in the same royal apartments she had occupied as queen during her coronation visit to the Tower 3 years earlier. That particular cruelty, housing a woman in the rooms that had once held her at the height of her power, was either deliberate or indifferent, and either possibility says something intolerable about the nature of the institution she was in. She was permitted to choose a smaller audience than was typical for executions of this kind. The crowd assembled on Tower Green, inside the Tower walls, not at the public hill of Tower Hill where common traders died, numbered perhaps 1,000, drawn from the court, the Tower's officials, and a limited selection of others. This, too, was framed as consideration. She would not die before the London mob. She would die before her peers, in relative privacy, dispatched with a French blade by an expert hand. She spoke from the scaffold with the composure that the chroniclers recorded with something approaching awe. She praised Henry. She asked for prayers. She said nothing that could be construed as an accusation, nothing that would make her death harder for those watching to live with afterward. Whether this represented genuine feeling, religious preparation, or a calculated final performance designed to protect the daughter she was leaving behind, the daughter whose legitimacy depended on Henry's goodwill, is a question the historical record cannot answer. Probably it was all three at once. The Portuguese dispatch preserved in the Calendar of State Papers describes what happened next with the particular attention of a professional observer trained to record without editorializing. The swordsman moved around Anne as she knelt, distracting her attention, keeping her from anticipating the precise moment of the blow, a technique designed to prevent the instinctive muscular flinch that could shift the angle of a neck at the critical instant. Then the sword came, and it was over so quickly that several witnesses later reported not being entirely certain they had seen it happen. What the dispatch also records, and what later accounts return to with a kind of horrified fascination, is the aftermath. The eyes and lips of Anne Boleyn's severed head continued to move for a period after the separation. This was neurological reflex, the body's electrical systems running down in stages rather than stopping instantaneously, a biological fact that Tudor observers had no framework to understand as such. What they saw was a face that was not quite finished dying. Several of the ladies-in-waiting reportedly could not look directly at the head as they moved to wrap it. At least one account suggests that Anne's lips appeared to be forming words. The swordsman from Calais collected whatever payment had been arranged, presumably cleaned his blade in private, and disappears from the historical record. He was a professional. He had performed a technically excellent execution. He had given Henry VIII exactly what he had paid for, a death that could be described to foreign courts as humane, swift, and even gracious. What he had also done, without any of the participants quite framing it this way, was provide the final piece of a production. Anne Boleyn's execution was theater from its first planning to its last moment. Theater designed to justify a king's actions to a watching world, to transform judicial murder into reluctant justice, to make a crowd of courtiers witnesses rather than accomplices. The sword was a prop in that theater as much as it was a weapon. Its sharpness, its continental associations, its technical superiority to the axe, all of it served the narrative that Henry needed the world to accept. Anne had understood this, perhaps better than anyone. She had reportedly joked, in the Tower, that the executioner would have little trouble with her, that she had a small neck. It is the darkest kind of wit. A woman who had spent her entire adult life navigating the politics of a court that ran on performance, making one final performance out of the only thing left that she could control, the manner in which she met what was coming. The sword came down, the theater concluded, and the man from Calais went home. The verdict was written before the evidence was heard. That is not a dramatic interpretation of what happened to Anne Boleyn in the spring of 1536. It is the considered conclusion of the majority of serious historians who have examined the surviving records, the trial documents, the diplomatic dispatches, the administrative correspondence, the timelines of arrest and accusation, that when laid side by side, reveal a machinery of destruction running so efficiently that it could only have been designed before it was deployed. 5 men were arrested alongside her. 1 confessed, the others refused, maintained their innocence until the moment of their deaths, and were executed anyway. Anne herself denied everything, argued with precision and clarity throughout her trial, and was convicted by a panel that included her own uncle, a man who had helped build her rise and now read her death sentence aloud without visibly flinching. What happened in those weeks between April and May of 1536 was not justice finding its way to a guilty woman. It was power deciding that a particular woman needed to be destroyed and then constructing the legal architecture to do it. To understand how that construction worked, you have to understand the position of Thomas Cromwell in the spring of 1536. Cromwell was Henry VIII's chief minister, the most powerful administrator in England after the king himself, the man who had managed the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the legal transformation of the English church. He was also, by early 1536, in a position of acute political danger. Anne Boleyn had become his enemy. She opposed his foreign policy, challenged his management of the monastery revenues, and had enough influence over Henry to threaten his position in concrete and immediate ways. Cromwell himself, in a later conversation with the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, acknowledged that he had personally devised and plotted Anne's fall. He did not say this as a confession. He said it as a statement of professional accomplishment. The mechanism he built was the charge of adultery, specifically the charge that Anne had committed adultery with 5 men, which under the recently passed Treason Act constituted not merely a personal failing, but an act of treason against the crown. The 5 men named were Mark Smeaton, a court musician, Henry Norris, the groom of the stool, and one of Henry's closest personal attendants, Francis Weston and William Brereton, gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. The charge against George included the specific accusation of incest, the most devastating possible addition to an already catastrophic indictment, designed not just to destroy Anne, but to ensure that no residual sympathy for the Boleyn family could survive the association. The evidence for any of these charges, examined without the conclusion already in place, is essentially non-existent. Chapuis, who despised Anne, who had worked against her for years, who had every personal and diplomatic reason to believe her guilty, wrote to Charles V that he could find no credible basis for the accusations. The men who allegedly committed adultery with the Queen of England had been at court, under observation, in a world where privacy was nearly impossible, and the business of watching powerful people was conducted professionally by dozens of eyes at all times. No witness came forward with direct testimony. No letters were produced. No physical evidence of any kind was presented at trial. What was presented was Mark Smeaton's confession. Smeaton was the only one of the 5 accused men who admitted to anything. He was a musician, talented, admired at court, the son of a carpenter, a man entirely without the legal protections that noble birth afforded in Tudor England. When he was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house at Stepney on April 30th, 1536, what happened to him in the hours that followed is not fully documented in the surviving record. He appeared before the court the following day, having confessed to adultery with the Queen. The question of how that confession was obtained has occupied historians for centuries. There is no surviving warrant for torture, which was legally required for its application to a man of noble or gentle status, but which Smeaton, as a commoner, did not technically require. Several later accounts, none of them contemporary and all of them of uncertain reliability, describe the use of a knotted rope twisted around his head, a crude form of compression designed to produce unbearable pain without leaving marks that would be visible in court. Whether this specific method was used cannot be confirmed. What can be confirmed is that he confessed, that his confession was the only direct admission of guilt in the entire case, that it contradicted the denials of every other accused person, and that it was enough, in the legal theater Cromwell had constructed, to provide the case with the appearance of an evidentiary foundation. The other 4 men, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and George Boleyn, did not confess. George Boleyn's trial included a moment of particular calculated cruelty. A written note was passed to him during the proceedings, allegedly containing a statement made by Anne to one of her ladies, suggesting that Henry VIII was sexually impotent. George was instructed not to read this note aloud. He read it aloud anyway, whether from defiance, from a belief that transparency would help him, or from some private decision about how he would conduct himself in the last hours of his life. It did not help him. He was convicted alongside the others. Anne's own trial, held on May 15th, lasted approximately 2 hours. She spoke in her own defense with a clarity and intelligence that her prosecutors had apparently underestimated. Contemporary observers noted the quality of her arguments. It made no difference. The panel of 26 peers, presided over by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who wept, by some accounts, as he read the verdict, though whether from grief or relief or simple physical reflex is impossible to know, returned a unanimous guilty verdict. The charge was high treason. The sentence was death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Henry chose beheading. He sent for a swordsman from Calais. He framed it as mercy. What it actually was, stripped of every layer of performance and legal architecture, was the endpoint of a process that Thomas Cromwell had designed to be inescapable from its first moment. A machine built specifically to produce this outcome, using the bodies and reputations of 5 men who refused to cooperate with their own destruction, and 1 man who did not have the legal standing to refuse. Mark Smeaton went to the scaffold still maintaining that his confession had been true. Whether he believed this because it was, because he had been broken past the point of recanting, or because recanting a confession in Tudor England was its own form of danger, the record does not say. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn all died asserting their innocence. They were buried, like Anne, without monuments, without markers, without the ceremony their status should have guaranteed. The machine that destroyed them was efficient enough to deny them even that. Cromwell survived Anne by 4 years. He was executed in 1540 on charges that included, with a particular historical irony that the record cannot quite contain, treason. His own attainder was passed without trial, without evidence, without the machinery of justice he had used so effectively against others. He died on Tower Hill, badly, under an inexperienced headsman who required multiple strokes. No French swordsman was imported for Thomas Cromwell. She changed England forever, and England forgot to write her name on her grave. That is not metaphor. For decades after her burial beneath the chapel floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, no marker existed. No stone, no inscription, No official record in the chapel register connecting her name to a specific location in the earth. The woman whose marriage to Henry VIII had broken England from Rome, whose existence had forced the legal and spiritual reorganization of an entire nation, whose daughter would become the most powerful monarch England had ever seen. She lay in unmarked ground while courtiers walked across the stones above her and said nothing, because saying something was dangerous, and because the king had decided that Anne Boleyn's legacy, like her body, was not worth the cost of preservation. The erasure did not begin with her death. It began the moment Henry decided she needed to die. The machinery moved fast and total. Within days of her arrest, craftsmen were removing her heraldic badges from palace walls. Her monogram, the intertwined H and A that had been carved and gilded into the fabric of the buildings she inhabited as queen, was chiseled away, painted over, replaced, or simply left as a pale scar on stone. Her portraits were suppressed. The royal arms she had been granted upon her coronation were quietly retired. Her name disappeared from official correspondence with a speed that suggests the disappearance had been planned in advance, that Cromwell's administrative machine had prepared for the erasure as methodically as it prepared the legal case. Her marriage was declared void by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, 3 days before her execution. The theological and legal logic of this, that she could be executed for adultery within a marriage that had never legally existed, was not a contradiction that the Tudor state paused to examine. It served two purposes simultaneously. It freed Henry to marry Jane Seymour without the complications of consecutive queenships, and it rendered Elizabeth a bastard, stripping her of the succession her mother had sacrificed everything to secure. Anne was executed on May 19th. Henry and Jane Seymour were betrothed on May 20th. The calendar of Henry's domestic life moved forward without pause, without ceremony of grief, without even the performance of it. What this meant for Elizabeth, 3 years old, living in a palace, tended by nurses who understood that the political climate required careful management of what the child was told and when, is one of the darkest silences in English royal history. She grew up knowing her mother had been executed. She grew up knowing the charges had been adultery and treason. She grew up as queen, knowing that her own legitimacy rested on the goodwill of a father who had declared her illegitimate, and on an act of parliament that had subsequently reversed that declaration. A foundation so legally provisional that any serious challenge to it could have unraveled everything. She could not defend her mother publicly without implicitly challenging the legitimacy of her father's justice. She could not mourn Anne openly without inviting scrutiny of the case that scrutiny could not survive. And so she did not. In all the years of Elizabeth's reign, 44 years as the most powerful woman in Europe, she never erected a monument to her mother. She never formally rehabilitated Anne's name. She never stood publicly above the unmarked floor of St. Peter ad Vincula and said, "This woman was here, and she mattered, and what was done to her was wrong." The silence was not indifference. It was the most expensive silence in English history, a daughter paying, every day of her reign, the political cost of a grief she was never permitted to express. The unmarked grave endured for 3 centuries. It was Queen Victoria who finally ordered the restoration of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in 1876, who sent surveyors to lift the stones, identify the remains as best the historical record permitted, and install the marble tablets that still mark the graves today. The tablet bearing Anne Boleyn's name is small, clean, and certain in its inscription. It gives the impression of a thing always known, always honored. It does not advertise the 340 years during which it did not exist. What Victoria's restoration actually was, stripped of its Victorian language of retrospective dignity, was a confession, a tacit acknowledgement by the institution of the English crown that what had been done to these people was not adequate, that queens deserved markers, that the condemned deserved to be named, that the floor of a chapel should not require you to guess beneath which stone the powerful dead were lying. It was a correction, partial, late, and delivered in the language of architectural improvement rather than moral reckoning, but it was a correction. Anne Boleyn had been erased in every dimension available to Tudor power. Her marriage unmade, her daughter delegitimized, her name removed from buildings, her portraits suppressed, her body interred without ceremony in a repurposed weapons crate, her grave left unmarked for over 3 centuries. And still, through all of it, something survived. Not because the crown preserved it, because her daughter became Elizabeth I. Because Elizabeth's reign was extraordinary enough that its origins could not be entirely suppressed. Because historians kept reading the documents. Because the questions kept being asked. The marble tablet in St. Peter ad Vincula says, Anne Boleyn. It says a date. It says a name. 340 years after the fact, England finally wrote it down. This is where Anne Boleyn's story ends. Not with justice, not with full vindication, not with the clean resolution that history rarely provides. It ends with a small marble tablet in a chapel floor. It ends with a daughter who became a queen and could never say her mother's name in public. It ends with a confession that arrived 3 centuries too late and was delivered in the language of building restoration rather than moral reckoning. But it also ends here, with you knowing what happened, with the documents read, with the questions asked, with the silence between the historical lines examined rather than accepted. That is what history owes the dead when it cannot give them anything else. The refusal to look away from what was done to them, and why, and by whom, and at what cost to everyone who survived it. Anne Boleyn changed England. England tried to forget her. It did not entirely succeed.